Let's talk about getting together a force of aspect warriors, grav tanks, and powerful seers, with a few thoughts on starting an Eldari army in Warhammer 40K 10th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought it was high time to update the Start Collecting Eldar video for a new edition of the game, and talk through a few ideas for getting a force of the craft worlds off the ground. In the video we'll talk over why you might want to collect an Eldari army in the first place, a few thoughts as to where you can learn more to deepen your knowledge on the faction, some ideas for planning an army and the first kits that you might think about buying, and then a few ideas on Harlequins, Ynnari, expanding the army, in-game rules, and one example of a current competitive list. Loads to talk about for the enigmatic space elves of Warhammer 40k, so let's jump straight in. First up, why might you want to collect an Eldari army in the first place? And I feel like in general there is quite a lot to like about them. They are one of the staple factions of Warhammer 40k since it was first a thing, essentially a faction of elves but in space, with even their mere citizen soldiers being able to fight and hold their own against the elites of other factions. And they're a very technologically advanced race, plying the void in great starship havens called Craftworlds, the shattered remnants of a fallen civilization, the heart of it torn out by the depravities of the new god Slaanesh. The Eldari constantly scheme and read the fates to try and save their race from extinction, and if possible build their empire back into some semblance of what it was when they were once great. They are few in number, but incredibly elite, and many of their soldiers dedicate themselves to various paths of their war god, Kayla Mencha Kane, exemplifying one aspect of war, whether it's the fast death of the Howling Banshee, or the total obliteration that are the fire dragons. In battle they make war with powerful psykers, predicting the foe's every move and reading the fates to draw the war to a successful conclusion, directing hosts of aspect warriors, guardian grav tanks and jet bikes, and ghostly wraith constructs, ancestors awaken from their spirit stones to take the fight to the enemy once more and defend the living. Miniatures wise, the Eldari have quite a large range as Warhammer 40k goes. They really had a lot of development very early on in 40k's history, and now their range has multiple different choices for many different battlefield roles. They tend to have an equivalent of one unit in the class for most of the other factions, though they don't tend to do hordes or expendable troops. Their army has long been one of the oldest and most in need of love in all of 40k. Unfortunately, Games Workshop gave them really quite a lot of attention in 9th edition, loads of new kits including a cool new avatar, and a remake of several Guardian style units, though still they definitely have quite a lot of resin relics in their range, things like some of the Phoenix Lords and Aspect Warriors dating back to literally into the 90s. I think Eldari players will be crossing their fingers for some sort of update of new stuff when their codex comes out. They also have a couple of subsets of ranges within their army, the Harlequins being the biggest, but they also have some miniatures for the Void Pirates of the Corsairs, and a few character miniatures to represent the death cult of the Ynnari. Taking a look at some of their miniatures, on the left here are the Guardian Defenders, armed with their shuriken catapults, propelling essentially razor blade-like shurikens towards the enemy, and some fight from the back of Wind Rider jet bikes, ridiculously fast craft that it takes Eldari reactions to pilot, and here we have a Farseer, one of the great psykers guiding their forces across the battlefield, this one armed with a singing spear. As mentioned, there's plenty of aspect warriors within the Eldari host. They often tend to be painted in a different colour scheme to the rest of the army. Here on the left we have the Howling Banshees with their Banshee Mass to paralyse the foe, and on the right the sinister Dark Reapers with their Reaper launchers, Eldari heavy weapon troopers destroying the foe from afar. In the centre we have the Avatar of Cain himself, a shard of a living god awakened by blood sacrifice and the sacrifice of a noble warrior. In the absolute greatest of needs, blood will rouse him to destroy the Craft War's foes, and he's a very potent force in game right now. Otherwise, for some shadowy ghost warriors on the left, here we have some Wraithguard, enormously tough with their Wraithbone construction, the pinnacle of Eldari construction materials, and they also have plenty of heavier vehicles as well. This is a Falcon Grav Tank. It brings some heavy weaponry to bear like the Pulse Laser, but can also transport a small squad of elite warriors into battle. Can be quite nice to go with some Aspect Warriors there. There really is plenty more than that. Their range is pretty big, and they do have a few other subsets. I'd say their pricing tends to be on the upper end of Warhammer 40k, but maybe not the worst. At least the squads and vehicles tend to be pretty elite and cost quite a lot of points as a result, often just due to all the crazy things they can do with movement shenanigans and things in game. The Combat Patrol isn't a too bad one either, at least it gets you a fair amount of points on the board. We'll come back to that later in the video. Finally, for gameplay, Eldari armies tend to be fairly fast and fairly easy to kill, maybe besides the Wraith units. and instead they rely on their movement shenanigans and crafty tricks to be able to outwit and destroy the enemy. Typically, between those rule sets, Games Workshop tends to write them with quite strong rules in Warhammer 40k's history. They've usually been one of the stronger factions in the game, or at least near the top, and that's certainly true in 10th edition so far, though I feel like they're almost certainly going to be in the line for more rules tone downs in the next balance pass, just given how strong they are right now. In their current form, they can bring some really quite powerful anti-tank firepower, with certain units like Bright Lances and Fire Prisms, with the Battle Host rerolls that they can get being just extra efficient. The core rule is Strands of Fate, sort of allowing you to cast the runes and plug those dice into key rolls later in the game. It can do both a bit of range and a bit of melee, maybe historically being a little bit more focused on the range compared with the close combat, and they often have some big synergy type buffs that they can do with Farseers, having some really good boosts that you can give to other units with their powerful psychic powers. Currently at the moment, they're arguably one of, if not the strongest faction in Warhammer 40k, though as mentioned, it gives them a high chance of having balance adjustments due to this. Overall, if you want to collect an army of aloof and enigmatic space elves, and have a glorious battle host of aspect warriors, jet bikes and grav tanks, then the Aeldari might well be for you. Moving onwards though, if you do decide that you indeed want to collect Aeldari, there's plenty of places that you can tap into the Infinity Circuits to get a little bit more information online. Index Aeldari is definitely worth a read just to get a rough idea of the unit profiles and the things that you can field in game. If you want to mess around with army lists and things that you could put on the table, I'd recommend tools like Battlescribe, New Recruit, Warhapedia or Games Workshop's app, all for rules and army lists. You can certainly try some things out before you buy them. Tabletop Simulator or just proxying models can be pretty great there. And there's a massive wealth of information on social media. Here on YouTube, I've made an Aeldari index overview and a tier list here on the channel. I'll link both of those down in the video description below. Otherwise though, just literally bang Aeldari into the YouTube search bar. You'll find all sorts of things, including battle reports to see them in action on the table, painting guides, lore of the faction, and there are a couple of fairly dedicated Aeldari channels out there as well. The two that come to mind are Proxy Hammer and Craftworld Eldar, both pretty popular from people collecting the faction. It is pretty awesome to have channels dedicated to the very army that you're collecting. Otherwise, I would absolutely check out social media. There's really quite a big and active Aeldari Discord server, and I'd likely follow on with the Aeldari subreddit as well, and there's Facebook pages too. They can be pretty handy just for imbibing a bit of discussion from other more experienced collectors and asking a few basic questions yourself from more experienced players. Otherwise, when it comes to actually planning an army to play in game, you could use the tools that were mentioned already to plan a rough 1000 point or 2000 point list, just to give you an idea as to what sort of endpoint you might be looking at when you're trying to get a collection together. There's definitely a few different ways that you can go with this. You can go via collecting things that are strong in game and work well together, though obviously that does change when Games Workshop does points updates. I think most people generally tend to collect a somewhat balanced army, maybe just going down the different avenues of the miniatures they find most compelling or fit in with their headcanon of the army that they're running. A pleasing mix of Wraith units, Aspect Warriors, Grav Tanks and Jetbikes. You absolutely definitely can commit to a certain theme though. You might decide that you're going full ranged Eldar or full melee or near enough, maybe playing a bit more of a foot dart infantry approach with Guardian and Aspect Warrior units, or go heavy on the vehicles. And otherwise you can really go down certain themes of the army. Perhaps the majority of core vehicles and things maybe fall under the sort of Guardian style colour scheme that most things have, or you could go for very heavy Aspect Warriors, build a Wraith host with Wraithguard and Wraithblades as the troops, and Wraith Lords and Knights as the heavies, or have a contingent of Harlequins along, potentially even try and collect Harlequins as the majority of your army or the entirety of it. You can also run a force themed around a certain craft world from the lore as well. And Ynnari can be another way to collect Aeldari that I'll come back to in just a second along with the Harlequins. For perhaps the most well-known craft worlds from the lore though, here are just 5 of the most major. Beotan, with their white and green colour scheme, is well known to be very militaristic and wanting to reclaim the galaxy for the Aeldari. They tend to have a great number of aspect warriors in their ranks. Ulthuid the Damned, with their black armour, have been long shadowing the Eye of Chaos. As a result, perhaps they have a great number of Psykers and Seers in their ranks, though somewhat trusted with ill intent with the other craft worlds out there. Iandim was almost destroyed by the Tyranids of High Fleet Kraken. As a result, they're forced to rely on a great number of Wraithguard units in their ranks. Elator are known as the Star Striders. Their core craft world is perhaps unusually puritanical, leading to quite a lot of their warriors going to seek the path of the outcast, and therefore they can rely on a great number of rangers within their ranks at times of war. And finally, the Wild Riders of same hand typically fight from Eldari jet bikes, perhaps unusually hot-headed compared with other Eldar and willing to solve problems quickly, directly, and brutally. None of these craft worlds are really make or break from an in-game rules point of view, they're kind of more for theme now. That seems to be the way that Games Workshop's playing 10th edition, as any craft world should be able to use any detachment when the codex comes out. Otherwise, after planning, you can move on to first models. I'd likely paint up a test model, and my first choice for that would probably be an Eldari Guardian or maybe Storm Guardian. They're perhaps the thing that's more akin to the core battle line troops of the faction, but depending on what flavour of Eldari you're going down, you don't necessarily need to use them. As mentioned, there's plenty of good painting guides here on YouTube. You could give Games Workshop's own guides a look for executing the basic Craftworld colour schemes in a fairly simple and effective way, though all sorts of content creators have made their own guides for most colour schemes. Any one of the major ones has a fairly good back catalogue now, and there's plenty of other ways that you can paint Aeldari. You don't have to stick to the Craftworld themes. They do feel like an army that quite a lot of people enjoy using a bit of airbrushing on. Though both dry brush and contrast paint can work okay, maybe a little bit less so on some of the vehicles that have big flat surfaces though. On to the exciting bit, and let's talk miniature purchases. Currently, for an entirely new player to the faction, it makes sense to start with some things that you're likely to use in lots of games, or just start with big discount box sets that'll get you a lot of points on the board really quite quickly. I'd probably start with the Eldari Combat Patrol, or if not that and you only want to dip your toe in the faction, maybe a basic box of troops like Guardian Defenders, or maybe some Wind Rider jet bikes could be okay, if you're still deciding whether or not you want to commit to the Eldar. For the Combat Patrol Eldari, I would say that it's probably among some of the better ones out of 40k out there. The box set costs £95, €125 or 160 US dollars, and in that you get a Farseer, 6 Wind Rider jet bikes, 10 Guardian Defenders with their heavy weapon platform, and an Eldari Wraithlord. That means that you'd get a discount compared with buying these separately of around about 40%, which is on the upper end of Games Workshop's Combat Patrol discounts, so really not too bad in terms of the plastic you get for the money here. And it's also comparatively at least somewhat generous in terms of points in the box, just north of 500 points in a Combat Patrol. Halfway to an 1,000 point army that you can put on the table already, and of course you can play the Combat Patrol game mode with it. Units wise, I'd say it's a nice enough mix. The core troops of the faction, which is no bad thing to have, some fast movers, a nice synergy Farseer for buffing other things, and then something that can actually deal damage to enemy heavies, generally quite well rounded. Currently in game, at least for competitive lists, I'd say that the Farseers kind of stand out quite strong. The Guardians maybe a bit more maybe, but they can farm you up some fate dice. The Wraithlord and the Wind Riders I'd say are usable, but generally overshadowed by other options. Though to be honest, usable for Eldari puts them at really quite a strong place compared with lots of other factions out there, I think. Definitely strong enough from a casual level. The kits contained are generally quite nice recent ones as well. I think that the Wraithlord is the single oldest miniature in the box, but even he holds up really quite well, I think. He still hails from the slightly newer, more modular era of Warhammer 40k kits, with some good choices on the heavy weapons and things that you can arm him with. Just for getting a whole bunch of points on the table at a fairly reasonable price, I really don't think it's the worst place to start. While we're on the subject of buying 40k miniatures, one thing I like to remind people in these videos is that there are other options aside from buying direct from Games Workshop. GW and their Warhammer web store is generally the most reliable but also the most expensive. It's their system that they tend to let third-party discount retailers stock their products, and you'll be able to buy much of the exact same things from them but get a decent discount off, usually around about 10 to 20% for say Element Games here in the UK. There's also Fenris Workshop in Canada with 10% off plus some store credit, or Gap Games in Australia with 20% off. There's plenty of more local providers over in the USA, or you might have some luck with Amazon, and literally all of those are links down in the video description. Any sales through them save you a bit of money and also help to support Auspex Tactics with some of the profits. I generally tend to aim to buy a new Warhammer through these discount retailers myself, and there are loads of other options out there. Otherwise, the second-hand market can be worth a look. Quality can be very variable indeed, but it might save you lots of time and effort. I think for Eldari, with a fair few fine details, you might want to really quite make sure that there aren't too many things obscured by thick paint. Could just be a bit of a nightmare if you're trying to paint strip models that are fairly fragile. Otherwise, 3D printing and third-party manufacturers certainly exist out there. Lots of people quite like to make near proxies of Games Workshop's Warhammer armies, and Eldar aren't really any exception. Can be handy enough for getting certain parts or weapons, or even some interesting enough stand-in or creative miniatures that could fit in with the rest of your army. Otherwise, for kits to pick up though, if you weren't getting them via the Combat Patrol, you could pick up Guardian Defenders individually. The basic Eldari troops are £35, $60 or €45. Kind of handy enough to have as a bodyguard to a Farseer while farming some Fate dice. Building these guys, I'd probably be most tempted to use their heavy weapon platform with the Bright Lance, really quite nice with the Battle Host rerolls. I'd say battle line units in Eldari armies don't tend to be things that you want to go too heavily on, at least for more optimized lists. And you do also have the alternative for the Storm Guardians, which are just spectacularly overcosted for the amount of damage that they do. They do come with at least a fairly handy sticky objectives type rule. Just for other options that you might be able to find in your local area, there are a few other previous discount sets for the Eldari. From left to right here, we have Start Collecting Craftworlds, the standard discount box that preceded the current Combat Patrol box, Boarding Patrol Eldari that came out in 2023 as a limited offering, and the launch box for the Howling Banshees called Blood of the Phoenix, in which it was Eldari versus Drukhari. If you can find any of these at some sort of semblance of their initial price, it might be interesting enough. The Craftworld Start Collecting had a War Walker and some Wraithguard, which were interesting enough. The Boarding Patrol I did think was kind of weird though. Strangely enough, it had 20 Eldari Corsairs, a Phoenix Lord Jane Zar, and 5 Howling Banshees. Certainly nice enough fairly recent miniatures, but maybe just a bit of an odd mix in there. Otherwise, as mentioned within the Eldari range, there's a few options for going down different paths. You could collect an army that's heavily focused around either Ynnari or Harlequins. In the lore, the Ynnari's idea is that they're basically the Eldari death cult. As their race has been dying, a god of the dead has been arising in the warp called Iniad, and they're attempting to tap into their power to destroy Slaanesh, the great enemy, once and for all. Their lore is that they're trying to unite the Eldari under their banner, and as such it allows you to field an army of both Eldari and Drukhari units. You can take one half of your army in Drukhari units, though a few things do get locked out, like the Avatar of Cain, Phoenix Lords, and Homunculus Covens. They do have some of their own unique miniatures, and if you want to field Ynnari, then currently the rules are locked to Ivrain on the right here. Can be an alternative way to play Eldari. They are currently quite strong as well, currently having the options for 2 different indexes. I would say that compared with other factions out there in Warhammer 40k, I feel like they have more chance for their rules to kind of wax and wane with how much support they get. The exact fine print on the rules for how you can field them, say, in the next edition of the game, might be very different to how they are now. Otherwise, for sub-themes of Eldari, they do have their own small range of Harlequins within the index now. Previously, these guys used to be an individual faction with their own codex support in prior editions of the game, though then they were rolled into Codex Eldari, and are now a small miniature range within a miniature range. The Harlequins are the enigmatic performers and guardians of the Black Library, and they make war as a dazzling display of acrobatics, with their troops here just dancing through the foe, destroying enemies. And as well as these, they've got a couple of unique jetbike type units, a Starweaver transport, and some Skyweaver jet bikes with 2 performers fighting from their backs. Currently they do feel like they're kind of unrepresented in terms of rules within the game, and just are literally units within the Eldari army. You can also ally them into Drukhari if you want to. My guess is that they'll probably get their own unique detachment when the Codex comes out, though we don't know how long away that is at the moment. Otherwise though, however you choose to do it, if you get a core force of some Eldari units onto the board, here are just a few thoughts for expanding with some stronger units in the current game. As ever in Warhammer 40k, Games Workshop absolutely can and do rebalance armies and change points costs around, so the best stuff doesn't usually stay the best stuff, but here are just a few stronger things at time of recording. Currently Wraithguard and Spirit Seers are really quite good for holding down the midfield objectives. They're pretty spectacularly powerful with their option to shoot again, and they make great use of Battle Host rerolls and the movement shenanigans stratagems. Warp Spiders and Swooping Hawks are great for jumping around, doing secondary objectives, and killing some enemy infantry. Fire Prisms and War Walkers hit extra hard with anti-tank. Night Spinners are pretty godly, ignores line of sight firepower that can also slow enemy units. Both the avatars are really strong, Cain and the Incarn. The Incarn gets to teleport around the board. The Autarch Wayleaper can be a cool lone operative and also farm command points. Farseers buff other units. Fugans may be one of the scariest Phoenix Lords, often just fielded completely on his own. An Illic Night Spear with Eldari Rangers give you an interesting lone operative style sniper type unit. Again, could be a pain for the opponent to deal with. With their current strength, I'd say that far more than this is really quite usable as well, particularly at more casual levels. I'd argue that middling for Eldari at the moment equates to kind of strong for quite a lot of other factions out there. I'd advise having a rough idea for what sort of army that you're aiming for, and then building towards it in small chunks rather than all at once. Get one kit or a few kits at a time, paint it up and play some games, and then move on to the next thing after you're a bit better informed. For rules for the army, Index Eldari is freely downloadable on Warhammer Community, and as mentioned there are some unofficial sources for the rules out there as well. For handy reference, you could find some index cards to pick up. It is kind of handy to have some visual references for playing the faction, though I would also check out the errata on the downloads page for Warhammer 40k, as a few minor things were changed, like the Phantasm stratagem. At some stage in 10th edition, Eldari will get a codex, though we don't know when just yet. Given Games Workshop's codex release schedule they gave us, we know that Eldari aren't coming until at least autumn 2024, and they could potentially be a fair bit after this. At the moment we don't know. The codex should change things really quite a lot. The main addition to them will be different detachments, so different sort of ways to play Eldari. It seems a fairly safe bet that there might be one focusing around Aspect Warriors, one around Wraith units and one around Harlequins, and there might be some curveballs. If you really do think that you want to collect Eldari though, I wouldn't stress too much about this and I'd get going straight away, though it might have a bit more motivation to build up a fairly balanced collection with different options available to you, as opposed to just going all in on one thing, as we don't know what they'll get with their codex. For the moment though, they have their index rules. As mentioned, their core rule is Strands of Fate, which I think is really quite evocative. The idea for this is that you roll 12 dice at the start of the game, and it sort of feels like the Farseers casting the runes. And then from there you can use those Strands of Fate dice to put those rolls that you made into rolls later in the game. Say for example using an automatic 5 to get a long advance roll if you wanted, an automatic 4 to pass an invulnerable save, or an automatic 6 to trigger something like a devastating wound. Farseers get to manipulate this as well, giving you more 6s, which makes them particularly powerful. Otherwise, most of the Eldari supporting rules tend to be really quite strong. Their core battle host rerolls are perhaps surprisingly overtuned compared with many other factions in 40k. Each time your unit shoots or fights, you get to reroll one hit roll and one wound roll, making it spectacularly good for hard-hitting anti-tank firepower. Fate's Messenger I'd rate as the single best enhancement. This one again gives you dice manipulation shenanigans, changing either a hit, wound or save to a 6 each turn, which is basically guaranteed extra damage or defense. And out of the stratagems, even though Phantasm is now locked to infantry only, it's still rather amazing. After your opponent's movement phase is over, you get to move one unit 7 inches. Basically a perfect knowledge bit of repositioning there that you could use to backpedal from charges or hide a unit from enemy shooting, and it could be very frustrating for your opponent. Finally, here's just one example of what a competitive Eldari list looks at the moment, though as mentioned this might change with balance updates. This is an army list by a Folger Piles who used it to take first at Glass City GT, going 5 wins straight at a big 70-player tournament. I probably wouldn't take this too much to heart if you're a completely new player to the faction. You probably want to build up something a bit more balanced than this, but it definitely does showcase some of the scariest stuff right now. There's an Autarch Wayleaper who farms command points and jumps around doing lone operative things. He's got the Phoenix Gem to resurrect on death to make him extra hard for the enemy to catch up with. There's Fugan, Phoenix Lord of the Burning Lance. He's an enormous threat in his own right with his fire pike and makes great use of Strands of Fate. There's a Spirit Seer with Fate's Messenger leading a big unit of 10 Wraith Guard with the Wraith Cannons. These guys seem to be a fairly standard choice to move up to the midfield and take it against all comers. The Wraith Cannons hit very hard, the movement shenanigans can give them some big advantages, and they've got a very scary return fire special rule if the enemy tries to shoot them. The Incarn is the Ynnari Avatar of Death, very big and really quite tough with its half damage special rule. The scary thing with this thing is that it bounds across the board when a unit gets killed, so you can potentially have it pop up somewhere really disruptive with an absolutely massive threat. Then to support all that, for objective work, there's a unit of 5 Rangers, 2 units of Swooping Hawks and 2 units of Warp Spiders, units with absolutely massive movement that should allow you to be able to jump around doing the secondaries that you need to, and hopefully destroy some enemy infantry in the process. And finally there's not 1 but 3 Night Spinners, certainly one of the strongest Eldari units right now. Very nasty, ignores line of sight firepower with devastating wounds, and a really potent ability to slow down enemy units, potentially keeping big slow threats completely out of the game. Overall looks utterly terrifying, though I've no doubt that player skill also is a big factor in it placing at the top of a big tournament like that. You do run up against all the other really strong stuff out there. I feel like we might need to take a second look at a few of these units after the balanced data slate though, to see if Games Workshop increases points or something. In any case, hope that's been some food for thought if you are thinking about collecting an Eldari army in Warhammer 40k. Look forward to hearing all your thoughts and ideas down in the comments below. Any other advice for newer players collecting the faction is greatly appreciated. As mentioned, I'll leave my Eldari tier list and index review links down in the video description if you want something else to watch next. And otherwise, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I do tend to post new 40k stuff just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you have been finding these videos useful or interesting. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.